Well, I want to start by, of course, thanking John, thanking Jackie for, and thanking Dan and Gloria for helping organize this. And of course, it's a superb experience for me to try to share with you some of the latest ideas that we have in the lab. I want to start by opening the box and showing you a small thing. It's nothing extraordinary, but I sort of like it. Of course, it's the brain. It's my brain, actually. So it was printed out. It's already almost 10 years old. It's not real size, I should say. It's smaller than life. And of course, it's a printout. It was printed. It's one of the first 3D printouts that you could get from these rapid prototyping machines out of the MR scanner that we have in the lab. And it's just a plaster object at this point. It's just the brain anatomy. But I'm using this to ask this question for tonight, which I think is an enormous question, which is whether this object can understand itself, basically. It's as simple as that. So in the past 10 years, since this object was produced, we've made a lot of progress in understanding parts of it, I would say. And there are some of my colleagues here, Lionel Nakache and Laurent Cohen, who helped me work out with that, and Ghislaine, my wife. We've understood some areas. In the lab, we've been working on this parietal area, which is related to number processing, and we've also worked on this left occipitotemporal region, which relates to the knowledge of orthography and reading, and develops when you learn to read. But as John said, the idea is not to talk about what exists at the moment, but rather to speak about the new ideas. And the idea tonight is to speak about a research project that we've had for almost 10 years now, but is now running in full speed and will generate more data, which is to try to address the problem of consciousness. This is a sort of hubris thing for a scientist. Usually you have to wait until you're 60 or 70 to ask the problem of consciousness. I think the problem is ripe. I think that we can get real data rather than just talk about the problem. The major thing that there has been in the past is that people have barely looked at this object, but they have tried to generate, as it were, theories from the top. Okay? And we've had, for instance, wonderful physicists try to generate theories and try to tell us that this is a quantum computer and that consciousness can only be understood if we understand quantum computing and quantum gravity. Well, maybe we can discuss that later, but I think it's completely irrelevant as far as I can see to try to understand this object. And one of the reasons is the temperature of this object is probably not compatible with quantum computing. Another is that I have been several times in the MR scanner and we changed our quantum state as far as I can see each time we go in the scanner, and yet we don't change our consciousness. So you know there have been an enormous wealth of production of ideas about consciousness, and I think there are very few that are valid. There is, of course, the notion, the dualist notion, that we need a special stuff for consciousness, that it cannot be reduced to matter, and obviously this is not going to be my perspective. There is also the idea that every cell has a little bit of consciousness, and by putting it together you get more and more consciousness. This is also not at all my idea, as you will see. We could go on and on. I mean, people have proposed so many different ideas about consciousness. The question tonight is how to go forward with actual experiments. And we've done a few, and also we've tried to produce a theory after we've done several of these experiments, and I'd like to tell you about both aspects. And finally, in the end of the talk, I'll talk about the perspective for the future, and in particular, what I view as one of the main motivations for this research is eventually to return to patients who have lesions in the brain and in whom we have to understand the problem of consciousness, because some of them have lost it, they are in coma or in vegetative states, and other people we don't know. They might be locked in, they cannot communicate, and we are not sure whether they have consciousness or not. So in the end, it's an extremely practical problem. Theories are fine, but we have to get back to the clinic. So how do we experiment with consciousness? For a long time, I thought that there was no point in asking this question because we could not address it. And I was trained in a tradition, actually, and I think most of the neuroscience tradition and also a lot of cognitive psychology has been, you cannot ask this question. This is not a question that you can ask. I think this is false, and actually came to realize after reading a book by Bernard Baars that the problem can be reduced to things that are simple enough that you can address in the lab. I want to say right from the start that this means that we have to simplify the problem a little bit. And there are several meanings to consciousness, and I'm not going to talk about all of the meanings of consciousness, and I'm going to talk only about the most simple meaning of consciousness. So some people, when they talk about consciousness, they are only happy if we talk about the self, the sense of being I or me. And I am not going to talk about that. And maybe at the question stage we could consider that, but this is not what I'm going to talk about. There is also a notion of higher order states. I know that I know, and there is a sort of reflexive consciousness. And this is still very difficult to address experimentally. We could talk about it. We have a few ideas, but it's not what I want to talk about tonight. Tonight I want to talk about a very simpler problem, which is addressable, which is the problem of what we call access to consciousness. So by access to consciousness, we mean that the brain is constantly bombarded with stimulation, like in this room it's absolutely obvious, and yet we become conscious only of a very small part of it. We become conscious maybe of one item here and one item there, the presence of John behind the camera, the presence of this bottle on the table, and so on and so forth. You may not have noticed that there is a red label on the bottle, although it's pretty obvious to you now. So there is a distinction between stimuli that are coming into the nervous system and stimuli that eventually make it into our conscious awareness. And that is the distinction that we're trying to capture. And I know it's a reduction of the problem, but it would be good enough already if we understood that. The second point is that we can design minimal contrasts to address this question. And by minimal contrast, I mean that we can find experimental situations in which, by changing a very small parameter of the experiment, we turn something that was not conscious into something that is conscious. Okay. And Patrick Kavanagh generated a large number of such illusions or stimulation paradigms. Let me just give you an example. This is the so-called subliminal images that we've studied in the lab. If you flash a word for a period of maybe 30 milliseconds on screen, so 1/30th of a second, if you just flash it, you see it perfectly fine. It's no problem. If it can be short, but if there is enough energy in the stimulus, you see it. If, however, just after the word you present another string of letters at the same location, you will only see the string, not the word. Okay. And this occurs in a range of delays between the word and what we call the mask, the consonant string that comes afterward, which is in the order of 50 milliseconds. If the delay is shorter than 50 milliseconds, you will not see this hidden word. It's a well-known phenomenon called masking. Now, if you lengthen the delay a little bit suddenly, you will see the word all the time. Okay. And you can even find a location in the parameter range where the subjects will see the stimulus half of the time. So now you're in business because you have an experimental manipulation that you can reproduce in the lab that creates a change in consciousness. And notice that if you ask the question in this way, there are two aspects. We are relying on the subjective report of the subject. That is a very important point. It's not just a change in the stimulus, it's a change of the stimulus that the subject reports as being conscious. So this is a difficult point, something we have to consider. How do we define whether a subject is conscious or not? People have been very reluctant to use this sort of subjective report, someone reporting that he's seen a word, because they have thought that it's very difficult to do science with this type of subjective reports. But my point of view, and I share this with many others, is that the subjective reports are what define the science of consciousness. That's the very object we have to study. When are the subjects able to report something about their conscious experience, and when they are not? There can be other definitions. People have tried to propose an objective definition of consciousness. So, for instance, they have said that perhaps if the subject is able to classify the words as being animals or not, or being words of the lexicon or not, then maybe they are conscious. But that type of definition based on an objective criterion has been very difficult, because typically, even when subjects report that they are not conscious, when they report they cannot see the word, they can do better than chance on this type of classification tasks, some of them at least. And so the difficult problem is to decide which tasks are just manifestations of subliminal processing, non-conscious processing, and which tasks are just manifestation of an actual access to consciousness. The problem is not so difficult because, in fact, when you do the measurement, so when I vary the delay between my word and my mask, what I find is that suddenly the performance of the subject rises at the very point at which they become able to report. So it's an experimental observation which is extremely simple, but I think important, is that when subjects become able to report the presence of the word, at the very same time, many, many tasks become feasible by the subject at a higher level of success. It's not that they cannot do anything below this threshold. There is sub-threshold or subliminal processing. But above the threshold, there is a large number of tasks that are feasible. And that includes subjective report, verbal report. So what we want is to characterize this big transition. Okay. Below consciousness, below the threshold for consciousness, above the threshold for consciousness. And I'm just giving you one example which comes from masking, but there are many, many paradigms now that can be used to take the very same stimulus and make it in or out of consciousness with minimal manipulation, sometimes no manipulation at all. Sometimes the brain does the switching itself, such as, for instance, in binocular rivalry, you have images in the two eyes, and your brain lets you see one or the other, but not both at the same time. So the brain does the switching. So I'm going to talk about a particular paradigm, because we have to focus on one in the lab, but you have to realize that this is really a growing field now, where many people are convinced that there is the possibility of experimenting in this way. So this is the general approach. Now, of course, we're going to combine that with the methods that allow us to produce this type of objects, which is brain imaging. And I think we have not seen the end of the revolution of brain imaging. This is only the beginning. So it's hard to remember what it was before. But you have to realize that we are seeing through the skull as if it was transparent. And not only do we see the anatomy of the brain, but now we can see the activation of the brain, whether each part is being activated. And with other techniques, we can see the temporal dynamics of the brain. Typically with fMRI, you only see the semi-static pattern of activation, the scale of 1 second or 2 seconds. With other techniques, you can really follow in time, such as magnetoencephalography, for instance. So, what do we see when we do these experiments? The first thing is that when you cannot see a word, or when you cannot see a picture because it's presented under subliminal condition, it does not mean that your cortex is not processing it. So people initially thought that subliminal processing might mean subcortical processing, processing that is not done in the cortex. Of course, it's completely false. And we've known this for a while now. In fact, we can see a lot of activation created by a subliminal word. It enters the visual part of the cortex. It travels through the visual areas of the ventral face of the brain here. And if the conditions are right, it can access even high levels of processing, including something that has been really controversial in psychology, but now from brain imaging is very clear. It can travel all the way to the level of the meaning. So your brain can take this pattern of shapes and turn it into an actual set of letters, a recognized word, a certain meaning, all of that without any form of consciousness. Now you can ask, well, what is there more when you are conscious of the word? And if we do this experiment with fMRI, what we see is that when you close this gap and go across this transition towards consciousness, you see two things. You see first an amplification of the activation in these areas. So the very same areas begin to activate much more. It can be as much as tenfold, for instance, in this area that we've been studying, which looks at the orthography of words, the visual word form area. The second aspect is that several distant areas of the brain activate, and they include the so-called prefrontal cortex, which is in the front of the brain here, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, especially for words, this inferior frontal part, as well as the more inferior parietal sectors of the brain. And what we find also is that these areas begin to correlate with each other. They co-activate. I'm just giving you the facts for the moment, and then I'll try to unpack a little bit what that means. Okay, so amplification, access to distant areas, these are some of the signatures of consciousness. Now, if we look at a time lapse picture where we can really see the temporal unfolding, we see another thing which is very important, is that the difference between a non-conscious and a conscious state of processing comes late. We can look at the time scale from the very point at which the word is appearing on the screen, and we can follow it in time. And what we see is that it takes about 270, 300 milliseconds before we see, in the best condition, any difference between conscious and non-conscious processing. So what that means is that essentially for 1/4 of a second, which is an extraordinarily long duration for the brain, you can have exactly identical activations, whether you are conscious or whether you are not conscious. And of course, this is during this 1/4 of a second that you can get lexical access, semantic access, and so on, and even a little bit later. Subliminal processing can continue after this point. But at about 270 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds in our experiments, you begin to see this huge divergence between conscious state and non-conscious state. And what we see at this point, if we just record from the scalp and we record what is called the event-related potential, we see a very broad wave. It's very easy to measure, actually. And one of the claims that we make with Lionel Nakache is that maybe these things are not so difficult to measure after all. This wave is well known in electrophysiology. It's called the P300 wave. And it seems to occur only under conditions where you are conscious of the stimulus. You can get baby ones, really small ones, under subliminal conditions. And so maybe people will find conditions where they get a little bit bigger. But there seems to be already a sort of non-linear divergence. And when you manipulate consciousness in this way, you already have a very big non-linear increase in activation, leading to this very large wave. At the same time that you have this large wave, which peaks around 400, 500 milliseconds, you also have two things: high level of oscillatory activity in the brain, so-called gamma band activity. So the brain begins to oscillate in these high frequencies, above 50 hertz typically. And also you begin to have synchrony across brain regions. So what that means is that initially you have very sort of modular processing. You can have simultaneous auditory visual activation. At the point where you begin to have conscious access, you begin to have a synchronization of many areas that begin to work together. So I gave you sort of the basic facts for the moment that we have found and many other people have found. And now I want to give you a little bit of what we think that means and what could be the theory. And of course, we are on slightly more dangerous ground here, and also a little bit, I'm sorry to say, a little bit fuzzier ground, because we don't have a full theory. But we begin to have an idea. The idea is relatively simple, and it's not far from the one that Daniel Dennett has proposed, when he said that consciousness is fame in the brain. What I would like to say is that consciousness is global information in the brain, information which is shared across different brain areas. So I'm putting it very strongly as consciousness is, because I think that's all there is, literally. I mean, what we mean by being conscious of a certain piece of information is that this piece of information has reached a level of processing in the brain where it becomes shareable. And because it is shareable, say your Broca's area, part of it is involved in selecting the words that you are going to speak. Broca's area is being informed about the identity of what you have seen, and you become able to name what you have seen. Okay. But at the same time, maybe your hippocampus is informed about what you have seen, and so you can store this representation. And your parietal areas become informed of what you have seen, and so they can orient attention or decide that this is not something you want to attend to, and so on and so forth. So this relates to the feeling that we have that when a piece of information is conscious, we can do a very broad array of things with it. It is available. Now, for this to occur at the brain level, what you need is a special brain architecture. And following Bernard Bass, who called it the global workspace at the psychological point of view. We've called it the global neuronal workspace. If you look at the associative brain areas, including dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, inferior parietal cortex, anterior cingulate, number of others, what you find is that they are tightly intertwined with long-distance connections that crisscross literally not just within an hemisphere but also across the two hemispheres through what is called the corpus callosum. So you have these long-distance connections that link these regions. And here's a very simple idea, that these long-distance connections are involved in propagating the message from one area to the next, and at this very high level, where these areas are extremely interconnected, making a single mental object out of multiple representations. So this is where the synchronization comes about. Synchronization is probably what we are seeing as a sort of agreement between different brain areas. The areas begin to agree with each other. They converge onto a common mental object. In this picture, each area has its own code. Okay, so Broca's area may have an articulatory code, or a little bit more anterior, a word code. In the posterior, we may have an acoustic code, or phonological code, an orthographic code. The idea is that when you become aware of the word, these codes begin to be synchronized together, and they converge onto the same mental object. So, according to this picture, consciousness is not the feat of a single brain area. There would be no sense in trying to pinpoint consciousness to a single brain area, or maybe making an intersection of all the images that there is in the literature about consciousness and trying to find the area for consciousness. Consciousness is a state that involves long-distance synchrony. And during this state, it's not just these high areas, but you can also amplify the lower areas to get the message circulating. I hope by creating this picture. We've simulated this in the computer. You can simulate neural networks that are relatively realistic in the sense that you use simulations of actual properties of transmembrane channels. You put these together into fairly realistic spiking neurons. You put these neurons together into fairly realistic groups of neurons, columns of neurons in the cortex, and also with a little bit of a thalamus, which is this subcortical nucleus, which is reciprocally linked to the cortex. And finally, you put these together into these long-distance architectures. And by simulating this type of architecture, we found that we could reproduce many of the properties that I described to you that we observed in our empirical observations. So when we stimulate this type of network at the periphery, we actually see the stimulus climbing up, and if there is enough reverberation, if there is enough top-down connections, then we see this nonlinear transition. It's of course very simple to imagine because in any dynamical system which is looped onto itself, which is self-amplifying its own inputs, there will be a nonlinear threshold. It's a property of many of these dynamic systems. So there will be either a dying out of the activation, and I claim that's the subliminal processing, or there will be a self-amplification, nonlinear transition toward this high up state where the information becomes much more stable, metastable for a much longer period. And that, I think, is what we've seen as this late period where the activation is amplified and synchronized across the whole brain. So very simple simulations generate essentially all of these signatures of consciousness that we've seen before. Now, this sort of model can try to help answer a question which has been difficult to ask before, which is what consciousness is good for. It's a very important question because it relates to the evolution of consciousness. And if this theory is right, then we have a number of answers to what consciousness could be good for. It's not especially needed for computations of a parallel and statistical nature, such as extracting the best interpretation of an image, for instance. It seems that the visual brain does that in a massively parallel manner and is able to do a sort of optimal Bayesian interpretation of the incoming image and coming up with what is essentially the posterior distribution of all the possible interpretations of this particular image. That seems to occur completely non-consciously in the brain. What the conscious brain seems to be doing is to amplify and select one of these interpretations which is relevant to the current goal. And so with Lionel, for instance, we've looked at several experiments where we contrast what you can do subliminally and what you can do consciously. And we find that one very important difference is the time duration over which you can hold to the information. If the information is subliminal, it enters the system, it creates this activation, but it dies out. And it dies out in a scale of about 1 second, or a little bit more, depending on the experiments. But it dies out very quickly. So this is also an answer to the people who think that subliminal images can be used in advertising and so on and so forth, which is, of course, a big phantasm to a large extent. It's not that these images don't have an effect, but the effect in the very vast majority of experiments is extremely short-lived. When you are conscious of the information, you can hold on to it. You can hold on to it for as long as you wish, essentially. It is in your working memory. It is essentially metastable. The claim is that it is reverberating in your brain, and this reverberatory state includes a sort of self-stabilization. Right? The information becomes stable. And of course, it's a little bit like a telephone number. If you stop attending to it, you're going to lose it. But as long as you attend to it, you can use it. The model is that this is really one of the main functions of consciousness, to provide this internal space where you can do thought experiments, as it were, in an isolated way, isolated from the external world. You can pick up a stimulus that comes from the outside world, and then you can lock it in this internal global workspace and stop letting other inputs come in and play with this mental representation in your mind for as long as you wish. So essentially, what we need is a sort of gate mechanism that decides that I'm going to let this stimulus enter, and other stimuli I'm going to block them because they're not relevant to my current goals. So there may be complications in terms of the architecture, but you see this idea of a network that begins to reverberate in itself, only occasionally letting inputs come in. Another important property, which I've mentioned already briefly, is this all or none property. You either make it or you don't. So this is a system that discretizes the inputs. It creates a more digital representation out of what is initially probably just a probability distribution. So we have some evidence from that in experiments where we present a stimulus which is just at threshold, and we find that subjects report either seeing it completely, perfectly well, with all the information available, or they haven't seen anything at all. There doesn't seem to be many intermediate states, at least in some of the experiments we've been doing. By having a system that discretizes, maybe you're solving one of the problems that John von Neumann considered as one of the really big problems facing the brain. In The Computer and the Brain, he discusses the fact that, of course, the brain is an analog machine. And an analog machine has a problem that if you do a series of computation, you're going to lose your precision very, very quickly, and you're going to have essentially a totally inaccurate result in the end. Well, maybe this system is a system for digitizing the information, holding up to it. And the last bit, I think, is that by sharing the information, you can develop chains of processing. So one idea is that if the information is available in this global workspace, you can pipe it to a new process. What was the output of one process can become the input of another, and so on in multiple cycles, okay, if you have this sharing system. It's a big problem to share information across the brain because each area has a sort of specialized role. And so I think you need a device such as this global workspace in order to be able to pass the information around in this very flexible way. And when you think, of course, of the human mind, I think it is extremely characteristic of the human mind that whatever result we come up in, whatever domain, we can use it in another domain. It has a lot to do, of course, with the symbolic ability of the human mind. We can apply our symbols to virtually any other domain. So if this claim is correct, then when we do serial processing, one step at a time, passing the information from one operation to the next in a completely flexible manner, we must rely on this conscious system. And this implies that there is very frequently an identity between serial processing, slow serial processing, and conscious processing, which is something that's been noted by, for instance, Michael Postner, a psychologist, for many years. And we have some evidence for that. let me tell you just about a small experiment, and then I close with the patient story. But just one small experiment. So we can try to see what people can do subliminally by just forcing them to respond. Okay. So I flash a digit to you. It's subliminal. I've masked it. But I ask you, is it larger or smaller than 5? And I give you 2 buttons. I force you to respond. Okay. When I do this, although you claim you've not seen anything, and it's sort of bizarre to force yourself to respond like this, when you force yourself, you find that you do much better than chance. You are typically around 60% correct, where chance would be 50. So there is subliminal processing. There's a little bit of information going through, but not enough to trigger this global state. Now, we can change that task and see what kind of task you can do. So if we ask you to name the digit that you've not seen, you try to utter a response as fast as you can, you do better than chance, which is quite remarkable. So your lips articulate a word which 40% of the time is the correct number, where chance would be, if there are 4 choices, 25%. However, if we try to give you a task which involves 2 steps, then you cannot do it. Okay. So if I ask you to say what is the number plus 2, you can do it. If I ask you what is the number plus 2 and is it larger or smaller than 5, the result of that plus 2 operation, then you cannot do it. Okay. It's sort of funny because the initial experiments show that you have the information, right? If you named the digit, you would have enough information to do correctly much better than chance, right? But when you are engaged in a chain of processing where you have to do x plus 2 and then decide if it's larger or smaller than 5, there are 2 steps. Then your performance falls back to chance, presumably because you haven't had access to this system that allows you to follow this kind of algorithm. So we have a research project now that we call the Human Turing Machine, which is a little bit fancy title, but the idea is that there's got to be this specific system in the mind and in the brain, of course, very concretely, that allows you to do this sort of series of operations, piping one result to the next, and that has got to be perhaps this global workspace system. Now I've been speaking maybe for 30 minutes. I'm not sure. Let me close by mentioning the ultimate test. I mentioned at the beginning, I think if we have a theory of consciousness, we should be able to return to the state of the patients. There are some patients that have fallen in a coma state, but it can be the neurology, and of course I'm not a neurologist, but I'm working with excellent neurologists, 2 of them are in this room here. The situation can be much more complicated. There is a state called vegetative state, which we have to factor in which vigilance of the patient in the sense of waking up can be preserved. There is a sleep-wake cycle, and yet there doesn't seem to be any consciousness in the sense that the person doesn't seem to be able to process the information and react to the stimulation that we provide for him or for her. And of course, there are situations that are even more intermediate, so-called minimal consciousness, where a patient can, in some occasions, but some occasions only, for some specific requests, provide a response suggesting that there might be partially preserved consciousness, but on other occasions, the patient will not react just like in the vegetative state, so we don't really know whether this constitutes sufficient evidence that the patient is conscious or not. And finally, as you all know, there is the locked-in situation, which is very different in the sense that the patient is fully conscious, but can look a little bit similar in that the patient may not be able to express that he is conscious and can remain in a totally non-communicative state. So with Lionel Nakash, who is here, and Laurent Cohen, we tried to design a test based on these previous observations that would be able to tell very simply in a few minutes from the brain waves whether there is or there is not a conscious state. And we decided to use auditory stimuli, and because this is very easy, you just have to stimulate the patient, you don't have to worry about whether the patient looks at them or not. And we decided to use a situation which is called the mismatch response. I will not go into detail, but basically the brain can react to novelty either in a non-conscious way or in a conscious way. And the two are very easy to discriminate, we think, based on this late wave of activation. So let me just give you the very basic idea of the test. We stimulate the patient with 5 tones. The first 4 tones are identical, and the 5th one is different. So you hear something like tit, 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 tat. Okay. When you do this, it's a very, very common observation dating back 25 years ago now, that the brain will react to the different tone at the end. That reaction, which is called the mismatch negativity, is completely automatic. And you get it even in coma, you get it in sleep, you get it when you don't attend to the stimulus. It's a non-conscious response. However, after it, typically there is also a so-called P3 response, which is exactly this large-scale global response that we claim from our previous experiment seems to be associated with consciousness. How you separate the two is not so easy. Typically, the two unfold one after the other, and in patients, it need not be very easy to separate the two when the responses are distorted. But here is a simple way to generate just a P3. Suppose you adapt the subject to hearing 4 teats and then 1 tat. Okay. So now, yes, there is this novelty response, but it's totally expected. You repeat it over and over again. Always 4 teats, 1 tat, 4 teats, 1 tat, 4 teats, 1 tat. So you can expect now that the 5th item will be different. What does the brain do? Well, the brain still generates this early, automatic, non-conscious novelty response, but then it cancels the late one, because this is no longer interesting for your attention, for your consciousness. And now what you can do is present 5 identical tones. Teet, 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 teet. Okay. And this is the novel situation. Now, it's the unexpected situation. Now, the claim is that it's only a conscious brain which is able to take into account the context across time, which can realize that 5 identical tones is something novel. Right? It's something unexpected. And that's what we find. We find this large P300-like response only in subjects that are attending to the stimulus, only in subjects who seem to be conscious of the stimulus. So we've tested that with normal subjects, and this response reacts exactly as it should. When you distract the subject, you lose this response. When the subject attends, you keep it. When the subject can report the regularity, you see it. When they cannot report it, you don't see it. And then we move to patients, and this has been the work of Lionel Nakache and Tristan Beckenstein now in Cambridge. And what they've shown is that it seems to behave exactly as we would expect. This response is gone in coma patients. It is gone in most vegetative state patients. It is present in most minimally conscious patients. It is present always in locked-in subjects or in conscious subjects. And when it is present in vegetative state patients, you might wonder, well, is this person really in a vegetative state or not? This is really an open question at the moment, but it seems that the few patients who show this response are the ones that are very quickly recovering, or that were close to recovery, or you might wonder maybe they were conscious during that test. We have great hopes that this is going to be a very useful, quite simple test. You can do it on the bedside after 10 minutes of data acquisition. You have enough data to get this type of response. This is where we are at the moment. The beginning of a theory. You see, it's not a completely formal theory, and we have to develop into a more formal theory. A few good observations. There is much more we can do, and I'll just mention that many people at the moment are excited about the future of brain imaging as being a future of decoding brain representations rather than just detecting representation. So all I've told you today is about detecting whether or not there is processing that has gone all the way to a conscious level. The next wave, which is already in several laboratories, is decoding which representation is being held in mind by the subject. Okay. Not just whether, but what representation. And this is not completely science fiction. For instance, just 2 weeks ago, my laboratory, Evelyn Egger, who is a postdoc in the laboratory, has shown that you can take images from the brain, from functional MRI, and if you look at the pattern of activation in the parietal cortex, which relates to number processing, if you take 200 voxels there and look at which are active and which are inactive, you can decode which number the person has in mind, which number she has memorized. Maybe I shouldn't say decode in this very vigorous way, because what you can do is you can do better than chance. It does not mean that we are reading the subject's mind every trial. It means that where chance would be 50% for deciding amongst 2 digits, we do 60 or 70%. Not so bad, significant. It means there is a code, and we can understand a little bit more about that code. But I'm thinking again about the patients now, and I'm thinking that With this type of decoding tools, we should move to the next wave where we try to use these to decode the content of their minds and maybe allow them to express the content of their minds. Because there is no reason, if we can decode it, not to project it on a computer and use that as a form of communication, even if they cannot use their limbs or speak. Again, we've done some of that. So with Bertrand Thirion in the lab, we've looked at the occipital areas of cortex where there is a map, retinotopic map. And you can take the retinotopic map and decode what is the image that the person is currently viewing, a physical image, but also what is the image, the mental image that she is visualizing, even facing an empty screen. So mental images have a reality in these maps, and you can begin to decode it. And other people, like Jack Gallant in the US, have pursued this to a much larger extent, and it becomes really a reality now. So I really think that the future is going to be decoding, and the great hope, of course, is decoding the sequence of states and trying to see what William James was calling the stream of consciousness. It's not just one image, but one image after the other. If we could see this stream, then it would be even much easier, without even stimulating the subject, to see that there is, in fact, a stream and that, therefore, the patient is conscious. So I think I'm going to stop there. You don't mistake me. I mean, there is a clear difference between what we have been able to do and what I hope we will be able to do in the future. What I gave you in the last 5 minutes is really speculative. I hope we can get there. But it's already a fact that we can experiment on consciousness and get a lot of information about what kind of state it is. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm Juan Enriquez. I used to be an academic. I founded the life science area at the Harvard Business School, trying to figure out how the ability to read and write life code changes the world economy. And then I crossed over to the dark side and became a venture capitalist who invests in life sciences.
My name is Harlem Wasif. I used to be a non-fiction publisher, and now I am a multimedia artist. And I spend my time designing also networks on the internet, which could be social networks.
Katinka Matson, I am co-founder of Edge Foundation and a literary agent and sometimes an artist, digital artist.
Emmanuel Dupoux, I'm a scientist. I'm working in early language acquisition in babies and also how they set up their social interaction with people during the first few years of life.
Jackie Safra, I'm with Encyclopedia Britannica.
I'm Patrick Kavanagh. I study visual parts of the brain, how attention works, how we select and track things of interest in our visual environment.
I'm Lionel Nakash. I'm a neurologist working mostly on clinical neuropsychology and also working as a cognitive neuroscientist with Stan for many years now on both unconscious and conscious psychological properties and mental basis.
I'm Etienne. I'm a physicist working in Saclay at the CEA, like Stanislas, a few hundred meters from his lab. And in this lab we're working on a question about quantum mechanics, the interpretation of quantum mechanics, and also on the question of time, the nature of time, the status of time in the different theories of physics.
My name is Laurent Cohen, and I'm a neurologist in Paris and also some sort of an amateur neuroscientist, and I've been working with Stan and Lionel for a number of years, particularly on reading and reading disorders and language.
I'm Dan Spur, I'm a cognitive and social scientist in the Common Foundation of the Cognitive and Social Sciences.
I'm Janine Di Giovanni. I'm a writer, an author, a journalist. I concentrate on war, conflict, post-reconstruction of society after war. I've written 4 books. I'm a consultant to the United Nations. And I'm very interested in post-traumatic stress disorder. So your talk interested me very much.
I'm Philip Pettit. I'm a philosopher. I've worked in a number of different areas, from philosophy of mind to moral political philosophy.
I'm Noga Arika. I'm a historian of ideas, trying to bridge philosophy and history. And I wrote a book on the history of the humors.
I'm Sharon Paperkamp. I'm a linguist. I'm interested in early language acquisition and language processing in monolinguals and bilingual.
Stan, we all know about you. I'm Gloria Origi. I'm a philosopher based in Paris, and I'm also interested in some experiments on the web that I usually share with Alan.
Ghislaine Dehaene. I am Stan's wife, but I am also working in babies, trying to find what is a particularity of the human brain at the beginning of life to construct all these fantastic cognitive functions such as language, calculation, and so on.
Okay, so questions for Stan? Comments?
Would you say that the more continuous is a set of thoughts as opposed to discrete, the more linked the thoughts are, and the more conscious you are?
I'm not sure we are conscious of how many thoughts are occurring per unit of time. It's something which is very discussed in cognitive psychology, is whether they are discrete moments or whether it really is a continuous flow. It could be that there are discrete episodes and we're not conscious of it because, of course, this is the only system we have for becoming conscious, right? So I'm not so sure about the continuity of the flow of consciousness. That's really something I would like to experiment on. But the type of model I'm working with would predict that what looks like a continuity would be actually discrete moments.
Stan,
yeah.
The more I hear you, the more fascinating I find what you're doing, and the more dissatisfied I am at the same time with your metaphor, which you share with Bar and then of the working space. It's a weird, it's a metaphor, first of all, it would need to be unpacked, but at the same time you insist that precisely consciousness is not a location, so it's not a space, properly speaking. And it doesn't play much of a role in the way you actually describe the crucial element of consciousness, like hyperactivation, movement to a digital representation, connectivity, and so on. So why don't you just get rid of it?
Well, thanks for the challenge.
Or unpack it in a satisfactory way.
All right, yeah. I think we need metaphors at this moment.
Yes.
It's not a bad metaphor. I think it's a little bit more than a metaphor. I mean, it draws attention to the fact that there must be specific cells that are doing the job. So I really think it is an anatomical space. It's not the whole brain. It is, and this is a difference between what Jerry Edelman or Giulio Tononi have proposed and what Changeux and I have proposed. I should have mentioned that many of these ideas were developed with Jean-Pierre Changeux. Edelman and Tononi think that there is a core which can move virtually anywhere in the brain from time to time. In our view, it's an actual space of cells with specific anatomical properties. These long-distance axons that are branching and needed to bridge across these huge distances of the brain. It requires a specific genetic machinery. So I haven't talked about the evolution of this device, but we're thinking very much about that, and we're thinking very much also about specific pathologies of that system. Could it be that schizophrenia has to do, to a large extent, with the loss of some of these long-distance top-down connections? We are finding that schizophrenics have a perfectly preserved subliminal processing, which is unusual because there are so many tasks that schizophrenics are impaired with. Okay. But this is a situation where it's a very subtle measure and it's completely preserved. But they have a lot of problems as soon as there is conscious level processing. So I think it's this type of difference. You see, I agree with you, it's a metaphor, and we need to replace it with an actual physical model. I mean, we are doing these simulations to try to really make it very concrete. I think it's a useful metaphor.
One of the problems possibly with the metaphor that worries me a little bit too is that when you think of workspace, you always think of who's working in the workspace, you know? And it can smuggle in an image of as where there's a self, working on this stuff.
No,
I know you don't want that, but it can make it attractive.
That aspect I completely reject. Yeah, it's a workspace without a worker.
Could I follow up with a factual question? Has any work, is there any work that has been done or could be done that might carry this model into a study of animals?
Oh, sure. All right. Yeah, that's definitely the very strong perspective.
I mean, the old question of, you know, if our animals are conscious, I mean, can get reopened if your model is correct.
It's a very strong part of this project, this European project which just got funded that we are going to start. So yes, as soon as we have these very simple paradigms, I mentioned this local versus global reaction of the brain, we can look for homologs in animals. Right? And we know that these long-distance networks exist, for instance, in the macaque brain. They probably are not as diffused. It's not so easy to get accurate, fine-grained information about connections of the human brain. So in fact, we know much more about the macaque brain than we know about the human brain. But from what we know, it seems that this basic workspace system is already there in the macaque brain, perhaps in a more reduced form. When you look at the morphology of the cells, it's very, very interesting, actually. Already in the macaque, as you move from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, you see this adaptation for long-distance connectivity. With the dendrites of the cell become extremely broad in the frontal cortex compared to the very smaller cells that you have in the back. Well, that expansion from back to front is more than doubled in the human brain. So,
is there a correlation between that feature, which varies across different animals, and the extent to which they can pass this diachronic expectancy violation test you talked about? You know,
we don't know. We just don't know. This test has not been used for the moment. It could be used.
I mean, that would be really interesting to see, to look for that correlation. It'll also test your test. I mean, if you
absolutely. And yeah, there are some indications. There is a test, so-called trace conditioning, where you look whether an animal is able to bridge a gap across time between two pieces of information that is conditioned with. And it seems that this might be not too inappropriate test of consciousness in animals as well. But this is being passed by some lower animals, so I would really not exclude.
You mean even across time?
Yeah.
Like the 4 beeps?
Yeah.
Is passed by animals quite lower down as well?
Sorry?
It's passed by very simple animals?
Well, it's passed by mice.
Well, yeah.
So I would really not exclude that there is a minimal form of workspace in mice.
Yeah,
that would be perfectly okay with me. There is a form of prefrontal cortex, not huge.
I think the better perhaps notion for workspace, although I like very much the whole idea of workspace, is a chat room, because there's nobody in the chat room that's doing that. It's just a bunch of agents that are exchanging information, and some of them will go off and do something based on what they pick up. But you're combining two very different ideas in an interesting way. But one of them is about the architecture, that there could be such a central bulletin board, which is property of many complex information systems. And I think that's a very reasonable architecture for the human brain. I don't know what else there might be. It'd be hard to come up with one. But the other is the aspect of that I thought you had in your presentation, that the consciousness was a property of the conjoined information, and that it didn't belong to any given cells. There are no special neural correlates of consciousness, sort of magic neurons whose activity creates this wonderful property that we depend on, because without consciousness we're not really around. So maybe I can press you on that a bit. So when you say that some parts have to have long connections to contribute to the workspace and to consciousness, you're really just identifying the parts of the architecture that have more information going through them. It's not clear that those are critical for the state of consciousness. What you're saying that I think is really interesting is the idea that conjoined information itself is consciousness, that there's nothing else, that's just how it feels, and that anything that has conjoined information has awareness. It's not a property of cells and neurons, and I hope I'm not going too far, because I think that's an interesting proposition.
Actually, I agree pretty much with what you're saying. I think
so. Then
it is a functionalist perspective, really, that the consciousness is identified with a certain function at a certain level in the system. And it just happens.
That's the architecture. If you have an architecture which must perform certain function, there are certain levels of information representation that are at the high end of the architecture, of the hierarchy of decision-making. And we'd like to think those are what we're conscious of. But that's different from saying that conjoined information is the state of consciousness. But that's, you'd have to think, not of electromagnetic fields, but of information fields. And that would get you away, as I assume you're trying to, from the idea that there's some magic things that neurons have. It's not about neurons. It's not about axons. It's about conjoined information.
Well, I have nothing against that, except that, the only conscious device we have that we are sure is conscious of is the human brain, and we have to understand it. And it's made of neurons. So for the moment, and also when we want to be relevant to the patients, we just have to understand how this particular device works. Now, if we can abstract away from it and maybe eventually decide that all that it takes is joint information, that's fine with me, and maybe that's a way to build an artificial device that will have some of the properties of consciousness. That'll be fine with me. I don't think there is any magical property either. If you're thinking of something like Searle's view, that maybe you need some stuff, I don't think so. I do think it is not an isotropic property of the whole brain, as you can see. It requires a very special.
You went back on that first point. So why is it not? So then, what is that very magic part of the brain? If it's not isotropic, what is this magic part?
No, you said it. It's an architecture. It's an architecture at a high level. It's nothing magic at all.
That's the whole brain. Everything participates in that architecture.
Well, we know the whole brain does not participate because we have these non-conscious processing experiments. You get these huge activations and they're not conscious. You flash this word, you get this whole sequence of processing. The guy at the end says, there was no word, I couldn't see any.
I disagree completely with that. The guy was perfectly conscious of all these other things, the stuff. And the word part of that consciousness is there and didn't perhaps capture enough to bring the level of information up to that part that he could report. But the consciousness was there. There were lots of activities in the conscious state on that
we profoundly disagree, I think.
The mask, I can tell you all about the mask. If I'm that subject, I can tell you everything about the mask.
Oh, of course. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm
conscious of the mask.
But we can track these activations evoked by this word. We know they're evoked by the word, not by the mask. We think we know that. We can follow them, and they're very massive. And the guy say there was no word. Okay, you can say the word was conscious, but it seems to me, no one is going to be able to disprove what you are saying. I much prefer to say very simply that no, the word was not conscious. This is part of what it means to be conscious is that you can report it. You, verbally or not.
Well, take for example then meta-contrast. Okay, so you might not be conscious of the item that has been meta-contrast masked. So that's the target in the center, surrounding mask. However, I can tell you that it was there. I might not be able to tell you what it was. So it's just how your whole idea. Let's make it your idea that the consciousness is the information state means that is part of what I'm conscious of. It's just not enough for me to commit to saying, well, I saw the word. I had maybe a bit of a buzz. There's something I could have told you in the meta-contrast case. There was something there. I can't tell you whether it's a word or a letter. But I certainly have the feel of what it was. And at some parts of my brain, there is a representation you can use with classification analysis in fMRI, of course, to say, yes, that word was here. And that, of course, happens also with anything that you do become conscious of. That's your point. So everything before becoming conscious is its own unconscious prime. So I'm not conscious of the processing that led up to my consciousness of that word. But it was there, buzzing around. And then eventually it's part of what I'm experiencing. So I don't think we're saying different things. Like you're just labeling them differently.
I had a very stupid question. If I'm exposed to a series of extremely terrifying images that are masked, am I going to be totally unaffected by them?
Oh, well, we know you're going to get, for instance, activations in the amygdala, which is one structure which deals with emotion, particularly fear. So the fear component of faces is getting very quickly actually into the amygdala. And for all we know, it can affect your judgments, yes.
So
we have also found it can affect your motor responses with this type of stimuli.
But I sense fear.
Do you sense fear?
Will I sense fear? Will I feel frightened? Or uneasy?
I think not, but I am not sure actually. I think not. But so you cannot attribute a state of fear to a particular stimulus. But you might change your judgment.
Isn't the state of fear a state of consciousness?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah. Just like a state of pain, or yeah, there are many.
So the
many
masked images, although they don't go in my conscious room, they still belong to consciousness, since I'm afraid. See what I mean?
Yes, but I think in many cases you don't realize that you are afraid. You might change your judgments about the situation, but you don't realize that you are afraid.
But if I sweat?
All right, so you might realize that you sweat, but this is a very indirect consequence, right? So there is a very famous experiment that was done already a century ago by Claparède, which maybe you know about. This is from an amnesic patient that was not able to have conscious memories. Just a minute after meeting the doctor, he would not recognize that he had been with the doctor before. And so Claparède comes in the lab one morning and has a needle in his hand, so he shakes hand, and of course this stings. And the next morning, the patient says, "Who are you? I don't recognize you. It's the first time we meet," and so on and so forth, but refuses to shake hand completely. Because somewhere there has been a change in his decision-making or action system. But he's not conscious of that memory.
Yes, but I think that Adam is raising a question that maybe puzzles the non-neuroscientists here, like the philosopher used to distinguish a long time ago between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, and this case would be a case of phenomenal consciousness, and all your the tone of your speech is more of the access consciousness.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a huge debate.
What are you doing these days about phenomenal consciousness? It's just out of the pictures, it's no more fashionable anymore?
I am very distrustful of this phenomenal consciousness and qualia idea. Really.
Yeah, I mean, but it
I
used
think it's
to be
the wrong intuition.
Used to be a big fuss.
No, it still is. I mean, we have lots of debates, and I'm not a philosopher, obviously, but...
why is it the wrong intuition? Why qualia the wrong intuition?
Well, my impression is that once we understand all of the properties of this access system, we'll have understood what there is to understand about qualia. Okay. And the rest is just a sort of dualist intuition. The rest is something we have to find. It's like any science. We have to change our intuitions of the system. Right? The sun is not rising; it's the Earth which is rotating. It's similar. I think it's a dualist intuition in the end. If people tell you, like Chalmers, this philosopher is saying that I consider a brain which is identical atom by atom to another brain, and yet one is conscious, the other is not, I say nonsense, and I close the book. It's finished because it cannot be. Okay? When it comes to qualia, you have these two types of discussions. And I think there is one aspect of phenomenal awareness that we can explain. Many of these illusions have to do with what people call qualia. Right? It's about the subjective perception of something which is not there, which looks a little bit ineffable because it's not reducible to the stimulus. But we can explain it. The other part, which is something which is not identical to your brain states, I reject. I think we are not going to need Etienne, yeah.
You have clearly explained that the stimuli that have access to conscious are first amplified and then they become shared by all the parts of the brain. But what does this amplification come from? Because two people in the same situation won't have the same perception, won't be conscious of the same thing. So what makes the amplification? Does the attention play a role?
It does, absolutely.
What do you call attention?
So attention is not the same as consciousness. Attention is a set of descending amplification that will indeed create a selection amongst the many possibilities of processing the incoming stimulus. So you will amplify the color and disregard the shape, for instance. You can do that with your attention. And you see that at the brain level because you see the color circuits being more amplified than, say, the shape of the spatial circuits.
But can you measure the attention of a patient, for example?
Can you what?
Measure or have a measure of what is the attention of somebody?
Sure. Either electrophysiologically or just by measuring the presence of this amplification. And that's actually how you can tell that it's not the same as consciousness. For instance, a subliminal stimulus can attract attention. Okay? And it can attract attention even without becoming conscious. So we see these attention areas of the dorsal brain becoming active in a lateralized manner and beginning to amplify the activation, but it's not sufficient, and the system collapses and is not conscious. We also see the contrary. We have a situation where the subject is attentive. Attention amplifies the non-conscious stimulus, and yet it's not sufficient to, again, bring it to consciousness. So we have attention effects on subliminal processing. All of these things exist, and they show that attention is not the same as consciousness, but attention helps gate stimuli into consciousness, I think. And it's one of the operators that allow you to select information, basically. But it's not needed, strictly speaking. Right? If there is a big siren in this room, you're going to have your attention attracted to the stimulus and you'll become aware. So you can dissociate it.
You mean that by attention top-down phenomena? You seem to have a kind of narrow view, because indeed, as you said, if there's a siren in this room, your attention will be attracted.
Right.
So you can attend to things for top-down reason or bottom-up.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So are there cases of something being conscious and not attended to, or something being attended to and not conscious?
I think you need to have some minimal form of attention before you begin to be conscious, but that's almost circular, right? If you call attention the top-down component, well, I've told you that you need this reverberation of information, so it's bottom-up, top-down, before you can be conscious. Okay. So there is necessary top-down component, I think, to any conscious state. It's a matter of definition whether you want to call that attention or not. If you focus on a more narrow definition of attention, where such as spatial attention, then probably it's not needed, not all the time.
If I may then pursue. So one of the things you insisted on, and I think very, very, very interesting, is the notion that we get to kind of different representational format when we're conscious. Things become digitalized, you said.
Yeah, that's a more speculative aspect.
Okay, but let's go ahead with the speculation, because it might, I mean, it fits well with the notion of information then suddenly becoming accessible to many more systems in the brain and so on. Because if you have some representational state or informational state that is not digitalized, it may operate locally. It cannot be represented in any higher form. So what I want to do is, you start by saying, I will not take into account the higher order thought view of consciousness. But in a way, you may have brought it back by the back door, because by suggesting that you have a specific representational format for conscious information, this format may precisely make it accessible to further processes that would not be able to operate on the information V2 and not digitalized. So that's something that does plays a role similar to your workspace, but with a different metaphor, and we're closer actually to processing characterization than it's less metaphorical. And it links it to the approach to consciousness that you said, I want to take care of them, look at them, which is higher order thought.
Yeah.
Wow, I like this perspective, but I still don't know what is the I. You know, in higher order thought, you need to say, I know that I've seen something.
Well,
right?
you need to know, it's more.
I can imagine a state of a computer, or state of the brain where one area represents what another knows. That's fine, and then maybe that's all there is to higher order thought, except there is this notion of the self, right? The I which is doing the knowing. This part I really don't know.
You don't need it.
If you don't need it,
we'll become too technical with it.
But that's the one aspect which I find quite difficult still. It's this notion of the self. I'm not sure how to address it.
But can we have, because your definition of consciousness and your metaphor is that global information in the brain that can be shared, it's very close to how you define conceptual capacities in a sense. So
sure,
can you have non-conceptual, a non-conceptual conscious experience? That's what philosophers are very interested in.
No, I was thinking of the contrary. I was thinking that there is quite a bit of evidence for access to concepts without consciousness.
And the other way around.
Yes. So I think that concepts belong to the non-conscious to a large extent. So, for
So
instance,
of course, when you can have a concept, you can parse conceptual information without bringing it to concept. I can have a concept of a base without bringing this base to my consciousness in this way.
right.
So,
but you can show, for instance, that say I give you a word that defines a category, such as furniture, and then I show you a word that does or does not fit in this category, such as chair versus flower. Okay. When you have the word flower, you generate a mismatch response, which is called the N400. You can get this completely non-consciously. I think it's a conceptual activation. You must have activated the concept of the flower, the concept of the furniture in order to get this kind of response, but you get it in a completely non-conscious situation.
Yeah, but what you're saying, that's
it's a little
having
bit
concept,
having concept without consciousness.
Yeah.
The converse.
Yeah. So it's
is what you're asking.
Yeah, exactly. So conceptual ability is necessary but not sufficient to have concept. And now I'm asking you the other way around.
So one would have to decide what is non-conceptual information.
Can be
right?
conscious.
Maybe a continuum of visual information, something which is not categorized.
Yeah.
I don't see why it would not be possible to have, say, a representation. I'm thinking of the representation of color, for instance, which is typically a kind of information you use in these experiments. Is it conceptual? I don't think so. But you can be very keenly aware of one particular color, say, Klein blue. I don't know. You can picture it in your mind.
That's categorized.
Yeah, so smells would give you better examples.
But
we're strongly aware of smells which we cannot categorize.
Temperature of the water.
Yeah,
I was thinking of something
Taste.
non-conceptual.
Yeah.
I don't think you would call it conceptual.
Yeah, exactly. Temperature of the water, or
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's a good example. Heat.
Or somatosensory states as well. I mean, you're talking. I mean, of course, with this focusing on the brain, because half this is where we have to go. But the brain doesn't develop on its own. It develops as part of the whole, soma. And I'm just wondering if you think that within your program, you can eventually try to integrate also the dynamic, the body-brain dynamic, because without the body there really is no brain, just as there is no brain without the body.
Well, the general picture is that for each content of consciousness, there's got to be brain processors.
Right.
Now they can differ depending on the modality, right? So for somatic states, it will be maybe the primary somatosensory cortex, or maybe it will be the insula for states of the gut and so on.
Yeah.
In each case, you will need this kind of processor to get the information inside the brain, and then you will need this information to be linked to the workspace system.
Yeah, but
so maybe it's not satisfactory for you, but I'm going a little bit away from the body. It's a higher level representation.
Of course. No, I'm just wondering, for example, patients who lose a certain corporal function, whose brain states then are also affected, and that can also help you studying also what is coming into the.
But I was thinking almost of the contrary again, which is a situation where you can be, detached of your body, say in a dream, for instance, and have incredibly rich and vivid impression of motion, kinesthetics, and so forth that are not occurring. So for me, it's a good example of the fact that conscious states are completely created at a very high level in the brain. I'm not sure that the body needs to be in the loop at any given moment. Of course, when it is, then you have a greater richness of incoming states. But when it is not, apparently you have not lost so much in your ability to create this very rich mental state.
It's funny because as you described it, it seems that this rich area of the brain seems actually slower and poorer than what could be a faster brain, which is the one that reacts to the frightening images, and in quite a rational fashion. Since I do sweat, I do, all this is rational. But the thing is that I'm not aware of the cause, or at least no one has found a way to question me on the cause. See what I mean?
I totally resonate with what you say. That's exactly right. There is a lot of intelligence to the non-conscious brain, right? It's a very excellent parallel processor, and especially when you act, your actions are being informed in a very fast way by visual information in particular, in a way that is really beyond what you could access at any given moment with your consciousness. So consciousness is lagging behind, it's very late. And it's also poorly informed. I mean, it's really, there is little information at any given moment.
But William James was, you mentioned William James at the end, he was also aware of that in terms of emotions, for example, like you're talking about fear. Again, I mean, I do want to go back to the body somehow, because the brain is the body. But that, for example, yes, there is, you know, you talk about sweat, that's you know, we also know this, you know, the second nervous system, which is the gut. I mean, there are incredibly complex relations, as you know, between the brain and the gut on that level, which are also partly responsible for the reactions of fear that you might be aware of before even knowing you're afraid, if you ever do know you're afraid. So, I want you, again, what can you do with that?
Well, what can you do without? You can
With that,
have,
no, with that. Yeah.
Oh, with that,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was trying to get to the opposite point of view, once again, which is, you know, you can have phantom limbs.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking that. Yeah.
Phantom limbs is a very fascinating situation, obviously, where you have a mental representation without any sort of reality, right? Staying up there. Apparently, I am told that you can have phantom limbs even in children who never had the limb in the first place. That has been described in a paper in Brain a couple of years ago, which is extraordinary. So you can have a representation of the hand that you've never had. It sort of means that they are schema. And I see them up there in the brain rather than in the body. They are really schemas of a pretty abstract nature that don't even need any confirmation from the body in order to exist and bring you a conscious object. I think it's by the very same virtue that we can have consciousness of mathematical representations. You know, there need not be any reality to the representation. It's completely detached. That's perhaps the most important property of this workspace system, that it can be detached from the actual reality.
Does that mean you can have phantom thoughts as well? You could have schema,
Is this a phantom
thoughts,
conversation?
well, actually, have a syntax that can exist.
So what would be a phantom thought?
Sometimes phantom thought is if you somehow are aware of the structure of an event, like a scenario, even though perhaps the elements, the actors, and the plot have disappeared. Or maybe you remember the plot.
So what happens when you half remember a dream when you wake up?
That's what I'm thinking. I wasn't going to mention dreams, but exactly that. You have the structure of a thought, which is like a phantom limb. And you know it has these elements to it, even though you've lost the elements perhaps just as you wake up.
I'm not sure if I have these states.
So if
and you know the structure of the inside, you know the plot, but you don't have the actors or something
It's like a
that.
tip of the tongue state, but then for events rather than for words.
So
Yes,
walk,
the tip of the thought state.
walk that forward for a second. If you're right, you'd want to redesign how you make a computer chip, how you start thinking about a robot brain, how you start thinking about the web and accessing the web. Right? Because all of them ostensibly are neutral territories, and what you're saying is there are a series of embeds that make this a far better processing machine if you're starting not from scratch.
Well, you know, yes, I mean, I'm not at all familiar with how you design such things, but something, here is one thing that has struck me. You look at the Windows system, you have many different programs sitting there, and can they share their information? It would be very nice if you could tell the Word program to output some of its documents into PowerPoint, and then the PowerPoint could be sent, and so on and so forth. The only mechanism you have to do that is the clipboard. And there used to be, and nobody uses it anymore, there used to be some kind of sharing system where you could update representation, but it got lost, I think, recently. So the clipboard is a sort of beginning of a workspace system, right? It's incredibly primitive because there are very few things you can share. It doesn't do that automatically.
You wouldn't want that on your computer. This is exactly why you're there and it's the computer.
Yeah, maybe
you're providing that function. It started to provide that function as that little Microsoft Office helper used to do that was so annoying. And that's exactly, it knew
But I might want a computer that can automate some of the tasks I do. Very often they involve moving information around, like, I don't know, typing an address into PowerPoint that you get in your mail, right? Or in Outlook that you get in the mail. Ridiculous things like that. cannot be done, I think, because there is some kind of level of architecture where the sharing is not done properly.
You're arguing for a fundamental redesign of how you fire things.
Let someone do it. I mean, I don't think you can take my theory and be able to do it. But yeah, I mean, I'm hinting in this direction, definitely. I don't know if it can be done. I mean, do you think it can be done?
Let's do it over dinner.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Okay.